Thank you for tuning into the Keto Answers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony D'Agostino, and joining me this week is Dr. Angela Poff. So Dr. Poff is a PhD researcher down at University of South Florida in Tampa who does crazy amount of work on a ketogenic diet and how it can be used in metabolic therapy. So we cover a whole lot in this episode, her background, why she's there, but a lot of importantly, a lot of people don't know how ketogenic diet researchers sort of transport their findings to their own day-to-day life, which we really get into in this episode. So everything you need to know about ketogenic research, sort of what is on the cutting edge, but also how Angela is using this stuff in her day-to-day life. So tune in and I hope you guys enjoy. But before we get into the show, I just want to take a quick note to let you know that this show is sponsored by the book Chris Irvin and I just launched called Keto Answers. So this book is obviously the same as the podcast name, but it's very, very fitting because we just basically took every single question that we got asked over the last several years, all the questions I got asked in my clinic, all the stuff that I get sent to me day to day on Instagram, on YouTube, whatever, and compiled all of our answers, research-backed, everything that we've learned working with ourselves, working with others, in a really easy to understand way. So you can read this book from front to back and understand it just like a regular book, or you can flip to the back in the index and we've broken down each and every question. There's 268 of them. Things like, can I do keto while breastfeeding? What happens on a weight loss plateau? What should I do? What types of animal products should I consume? Are animal products safe? Everything you need to know about a ketogenic diet to help you reach whatever goal you're looking for is contained in this book. And if you are a keto expert, if you're a keto beginner, if you do not know what the hell a ketogenic diet is, but you're just curious to learn a little bit more, I guarantee that there's something in this book for everyone. And just as a side note, Chris and I do not take any profit from this book. Everything goes back into funneling into content, into research, into product development. So we are not profiting from this thing at all. We just want to get the information out there in one condensed spot so you can finally get it. So Keto Answers is on Amazon. You can buy it today. And if you do, please give us some feedback. So writing reviews is the most helpful thing you could do. That really helps our ranking shoot up in Amazon and make sure that people who otherwise wouldn't see the book, see it, get it, read it, and we help as many people as seemingly possible. And if you've already picked up the book, thank you so much for your support. Again, a review would mean a whole hell of a lot. We're just trying to help as many people as we possibly can. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Angela, thank you for being on the podcast today.
Thank you, Anthony. Happy to go on it.
Yeah, so you are, so maybe just to give people some information, just a little bit of your background currently and what you're doing.
Sure. I'm a research associate at the University of South Florida in the Department of Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology. I work with Dr. Dominic D'Agostino. We have a lab here where we study metabolism and how it pertains to the development and potential therapeutic interventions for a variety of diseases. Primary focus for me would be cancer. So I study cancer metabolism, how things like a ketogenic diet or other non-toxic ways to target metabolism could be a useful adjuvant to standard of care therapy for cancer. But our lab also looks at non-toxic metabolic targeted therapies for other diseases, such as seizure disorders and also neurogenetic disorders, including some rare disorders like Kabuki syndrome, which is something that we've more recently started studying. So we have a wide array of interests, kind of all related to how we can optimize metabolism to prevent and treat disease.
Got it. Before we dive in deeper on that and like what you do on a day-to-day basis, just curious as far as your background and what got you interested in this field in the first place.
Sure. So I was always interested in science. I was, even as a young girl, I was very much like a tomboy. I would always be playing outside. I would catch lizards and grasshoppers. And I was just so interested in that kind of science. So biology class always really interested me to the point where I never really thought about doing anything else. Probably from the time that I knew being a scientist was an option, I was decidedly going to be a scientist. And I always really loved the idea of contributing something new to the wealth of knowledge that was out there. So just reading scientific textbooks and thinking about how literally each line of these textbooks are represented by some scientists in history that had an interesting question or idea and tested that hypothesis and came up with something new that had never been known before. And that always really drew me to the idea of being a scientist. So after high school, I went to college with that in mind. I studied biochemistry and molecular biology at Hendrix College, which is a small liberal arts college in Arkansas, which is where I grew up. I had a really great experience there where the college is very intent on experiential learning. And so I was actually able to work in a neuroscience research lab for 3 years at undergrad and able to do some really, really interesting research and actually present at some national conferences even while I was an undergrad, which kind of furthered my, solidified my interest in going on to graduate school and being a scientist. So then I decided to do my PhD after undergrad, and I came down to University of South Florida for a PhD program in biomedical sciences and started looking around for labs to join. So when you start a PhD program, you have to identify who's going to be your major professor and the project that you're going to work on for your dissertation project. And that's when I met Dr. D'Agostino. He was a new faculty member here at USF. This was about 10 years ago or so. And he was doing a lot of work at that time for the Navy, looking at mitigation strategies to combat a unique type of seizure that manifests when you breathe high oxygen concentrations at depth, so such as a Navy SEAL diver might experience. And that led him down the rabbit hole to looking at ketosis, which, of course, a ketogenic diet has been used clinically for 100 years, actually, to treat epilepsy when it's refractory to medication. And so he was doing work in that field, and at the time had kind of stumbled across this idea that there wasn't a ton of research on at the time, but this thought that maybe ketosis had some properties that could be anti-cancerous. And that was at the time I was looking for a research lab, and I met Dr. D'Agostino, and he described these ideas to me, and it just sounded really fascinating. In part because it seemed so novel. It's funny now when I think about at that time the idea of a diet impacting something as serious as cancer. It seemed surprising to me because now it seems so obvious that something so impactful as a diet would have major impacts on something like cancer. But at the time, it was very intriguing and surprising. And I'd had some personal experience with cancer, and so my father had brain tumors. Starting when he was very young, he had them and had them irradiated with some pretty intense radiation therapy, which saved his life, allowed him to live past, his expectation into his, into relatively old age, and allowed me to come around. So that radiation, saved his life, but caused very long-lasting negative effects in that he had cognitive and physical decline over time. And, this was at a time we're a lot better now at using targeted radiation to eliminate much of those off-target effects. But at that time, it was kind of more intense whole brain irradiation type therapy. And so I think I was just very intrigued by this idea that maybe there's some non-toxic ways that we can support standard of care therapies so that we can protect our healthy tissue while putting more stress on the tumor. And I love that idea about potentially using diet to do that. And so I think that really kind of caught my eye, and I decided to join Dom's lab and start up the cancer research program in his lab.
Yeah. So do you guys now still split your sort of research focuses, and is everybody all in on this sort of like metabolic therapies, or how do you split up research now?
Yeah, I would say our whole lab is pretty dynamic in their interests. We kind of have people have more specific areas of interest or expertise. I really enjoy and tend to focus on the cancer work in our lab. Dom is a classically trained neuroscientist, and that's more his wheelhouse. But we all kind of are familiar with the whole territory and contribute in other ways. I think that is also a really important part to this kind of science, is being multidisciplinary, because we can understand and learn a lot from each other. So we're lucky that the epilepsy field has a very long history of studying the ketogenic diet and metabolism in that disease state. And there's a lot that we can learn from each other. So those in cancer biology, for example, or people studying neurodevelopmental disorders can look at things like epilepsy and learn from them. So the lab, definitely we have people who kind of tend to focus on certain things, but we're all also contributing to most of the projects that come out of the lab.
Got it. And how many researchers do you guys have?
So right now, let me see. We have about 7 full-time people, and then we have a number of students who come in and will volunteer or work as a student researcher for some period of time here and there.
Yeah, so
it's about a moderately sized lab.
I would say I'm sure on you guys' end the answer is not enough. Of course.
That's always the case. Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things you mentioned before was that you sort of had this transition in how you were thinking about cancer therapies and in that, how could nutrition affect any of this? But now you're like, obviously, how could it not? So, I mean, what did you learn that brought you from one mindset to the other?
I think just learning how impactful nutrition is on everything that happens in our bodies. I mean, it is, I would say, one of the main stimuli that our body is receiving. It tells our internal systems a lot about the outside world. So is there enough, food available right now to provide energy to turning over, new cells within a tissue? Or do we need to basically, manipulate our metabolic pathways in a way that reflect what the outside world is telling us? So in knowing now that everything that you eat gets metabolized into a particular energy metabolite that is not just a source of ATP, but in fact has, potent signaling properties, for example, where it will activate or deactivate or modulate certain pathways within the cell or the tissues, incite or suppress inflammation, all of these things that are really keys to health or disease. So
right.
It's not some benign, just kind of, you have to eat and it doesn't really matter. It makes a huge impact.
Yeah,
exactly. What you're eating and how you're eating.
I think a lot of people just assume that it's just something that I do. You just get some energy from it and you move on. But as far as what you've learned, and that's a really good way to put it. That it's sort of is a way to tell your body the status of the outside world in a lot of different ways. I mean, how has that changed your perspective on how you approach nutrition personally?
Well, it's definitely opened my eyes. I mean, I think back to like college, for example, and how, I ate in college and, how I didn't think about sleep, sleep health and stress management and all of those ways. And I was younger then, so maybe a little bit, more capable of dealing with it. But it certainly changed my thought process on the way that I eat. And then also I have a toddler son, so I think a lot about how he eats and how I want to lay the groundwork for a healthy development for him, both physically and mentally and emotionally. I still struggle with food choices and my weight. It's been a constant source of struggle in my life. And I think a lot of it probably came from just not having real knowledge about nutrition when I was growing up, and just hoping that, now I can kind of change that story for my children. But yeah, it's definitely influenced me and the choices I make on a daily basis, for sure.
So, I mean, what does your day-to-day nutrition look like now?
So it generally, I don't eat a full ketogenic diet. It's also kind of, it's a little bit hard. So it's been interesting for me to see this kind of transition where keto is a very mainstream conversation now. because for such a long time when I thought ketogenic diet, to me, that was a true 4-to-1 ratio of fat to protein, or fat to protein and carbohydrate.
Right.
90% of your calories coming from fat. And so, but that's not really what's being described on the general person says, oh, I'm eating keto. In general, it's more of just a pretty strict reduction in carbohydrates, sometimes, or sometimes not even really too much monitoring of protein. So, for me, I tend to think I try to eat generally lower glycemic index, low carb diet. I'm not crazy about it. If I have something special going on, I'll indulge if I want to in something, because that helps me maintain. For me, it's all about what is a sustainable lifestyle. And so that's typically what I choose to do, kind of a low carb, smart carb for my daily choices, but then allowing myself to, be able to indulge if I want to. So that tends to work for me. It has been an interesting couple of years, though. I mentioned I have a toddler, and I found that for me personally, food choices were a lot more difficult going through pregnancy and through breastfeeding as well, because carbohydrate intake really dramatically affected my breast milk production. And so that was a long time that I was kind of having to balance this issue, wanting to make sure that I wasn't overeating carbohydrates, but then also make sure that I was still producing enough breast milk. So that was a personal experience. I think everyone has kind of a different experience with that as well. And we're actually expecting our next child in the spring. So I'm kind of dealing with pregnancy-related nutrition issues again. So it's a little harder in the first trimester to kind of get through those kind of issues. So,
obviously, like very off topic from what you do on a day-to-day basis, but as far as like, how do you approach your nutrition regarding ketosis and having low carb in pregnancy? Do you change anything around? Do you modify anything specifically? Obviously, there's a lot of different nutrient demands, but
there definitely is. I have found that it's hard for me, especially early in pregnancy, to eat a very low carbohydrate diet, in part because I struggle with pregnancy-related nausea very significantly, and it seems to be very tightly related to my blood glucose levels, and I've kind of measured them from time to time, and as they drop, I'll find that that's when my nausea gets really significant, so I kind of tend to graze during the day, which is very atypical for me because, before I would typically do intermittent fasting and don't eat breakfast and kind of eat a late lunch, but now it's not really an option currently, but I definitely don't, just personally, I don't, strive to be at some specific level of ketosis. I probably go a little bit in and out. I kind of fluctuate in and out of mild levels of ketosis pretty easily, as long as I'm eating a fairly lower carbohydrate diet. So it's not something I measure too often, especially right now, as I'm kind of going through this stage. I just kind of let my body tell me what it needs at this point.
Which I think is a great way to address it. And I think that a lot of people freak out right now with how popular ketogenic diet has gotten. But I think that if you doing all the research you're doing, especially in metabolic therapies, I think that some people just demonize carbohydrates. Like if you eat any carbs, you're going to die. Like for instance, like a couple of weeks ago, my fiance made a little like a charcuterie type board thing with some cheese and some meat or whatever, and there were figs on the plate. And I posted a photo of it, and people are like, "What? You're eating figs? Can I eat figs? I'm gonna die? I thought figs kill you." I'm like, "Oh man!" I had literally two figs. Just curious about your perspective on there regarding carbohydrate intake and people's fear of it.
I'm right there with you. I do think that there tends to be there in some cases there can be a little bit of an extreme overreaction, and we kind of have to think of everything as a balance, and just because I don't know, it's your overall picture, right? So I'm not scared of a couple of figs, but some people respond differently. So you kind of just have to know what works for you and your body, and it's totally different. Some people can handle even a fair amount of carbohydrate, especially if you're, for example, an athlete or you exercise a lot. You can, generally speaking, people that are doing that can eat a lot more carbohydrate and protein and still even maintain a level of ketosis. And that's your goal, right? But some people really, to get even to a mild level of ketosis, have to really restrict those things. So it's all individual and depending on what your goals are and just knowing what your body does in response to those things, which is why I think it's really important when you're kind of adapting to, if it's a big major diet change like this, like go get your blood work done, work with your doctor, see how you respond individually, because not everyone responds the same way. And if you are one of those people that have kind of abnormal response in some of your, blood markers, then you need to take a closer look at that. So just being informed about what works for you, I think, is most important.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned about is just having it be nutrition guiding you sort of intuitively. And I think that your body sometimes has a sense of if you're really hungry for something. Like I don't think anybody should be, if they're hungry for carbohydrates, go eat a bunch of candy or processed food or anything. Like when I'm hungry for carbohydrates, I eat things like sweet potatoes or plantains. And I think that's totally, it's totally fine. And I think that, what you're focusing on a lot in your research is sort of helping people with metabolic therapies, but it's just very, very different from the vast majority of people. If they just want to look good, feel good, and minimize inflammation, things like that. Very different from, like you were mentioning before, the classical ketogenic diet, which is like pretty hard to follow.
Almost impossible for a lot of people, honestly. I speak with a lot of people who are doing clinical trials, and you try. I mean, when you're talking about like a testing ketosis as a true medical intervention for something like a clinical trial for cancer or, for some seizure disorder or something, it's often you try to do the most strict form of the diet just to see if it's possible. And there's a big issue with compliance, even in a very motivated population. So, it's all relative. So when someone says I'm doing keto, well, what does that mean? What does your keto look like? Because it may mean something completely else, especially if you're looking at something in the medical field.
Right. And so you mentioned before about some people just may not respond to keto appropriately. And I mean, in your research, have you found that is due to different gene polymorphisms, or is it just metabolic type? Like what are the reasons why people do?
I don't really know. It's not directly related to what we study. I just know that in general, studies suggest that some portion of the population may have some different metabolic responses. I assume it probably has to do with both genetic and environmental differences. So, but I don't think there's really been much research looking into why that's the case. So that would be a really interesting area of work for sure. But I don't think we know that much about it.
Yeah, I mean, clinically, when you guys work with people, are you finding that's, there's maybe 5% or 10% or 1% of the population just doesn't do well in it, regardless of compliance?
So we don't work directly with patients very often. So we have collaborations with institutes that do clinical trials. But again, it's hard to make any kind of widespread assumption based on something like a clinical trial in a very specific patient population, because you can learn things about that patient population, but how does that apply to the general public? It's really hard to say.
Right. And so are you guys using animal models and sort of extrapolating mechanisms, or like what is the area of focus sort of day to day?
Yeah, we primarily in our lab use animal models, and then we also do in vitro work, so cell culture models. That's the main focus of our lab.
And then how much time is spent sort of split between hypothesis generation and, figuring out mechanisms based upon hypotheses that you've proven out? Like what is sort of you guys have a lot of people working at the same time, so.
Yeah, it's really all over the place. It depends like where we're at in a particular project. That's the beauty of science, is it just kind of continually generates new ideas. And, whatever results you got from the experiment you did last week is going to inform your next step, whether or not that's a change in direction, a change in your understanding of what you thought you knew last week. That's the beauty and the ugliness of science, right? Is that there's so much information coming at any time. You can be really confident in something, but then also new information could come out that completely throws you off, and you realize, wow, I wasn't viewing that in the correct way. So, but it's fun that way. It's a little bit of a roller coaster.
Right.
So, we're just constantly kind of designing new studies to test what's going on at that time and seeing where the answers lead us to next month. So,
right.
And then in the middle of it, trying to write up publications and write grants to get funding to keep doing it. So a little bit of a juggling act.
So since you started, many years ago, like what are the major things that have there been times where you've been like, oh man, this is a huge leap forward in our understanding? Or has it been sort of like a cumulative effect?
Right. I would say definitely more cumulative. I would say it's been very interesting to see over the past 5 to 7 years, the big increase in what we understand about ketones themselves, and that they are so much more than just an energy metabolite, and they do have very potent cellular signaling effects in ways that we didn't even really, know were the case. So that they can directly influence gene expression, influence the activity of our immune cells, in ways that seem to kind of explain a lot of the effects of ketosis that we had historically seen on a systemic level, but didn't perhaps make a lot of sense. But now we say, oh, wow, that's how that's happening. And just, new information has been coming out every month, it seems, for the past several years where that's concerned. So that's been a really, I think, big leap forward for the field in general, because in science, it's hard to get someone to believe that something's happening unless you can tell them why it's happening.
Right.
And ketosis has kind of been a black box for a while. Like, why would a diet suppress seizures? That seems, it's hard to, people are professional skeptics. Scientists are professional skeptics, which is a great thing. But if you can say, oh no, look, it's because through this signaling pathway, it increases GABA signaling in the brain, decreases glutamate signaling, and we see an overall inhibitory effect on the brain that's suppressing, the ability for these neurons to fire action potentials to start a seizure, right? That's one of the things that we know happens now with ketosis, and that explains what we're seeing, and it's more believable, right? So that, leap in the field has helped us, immensely in understanding what we're doing, having more confidence in what we're seeing is real, and being able to, get funding to study it further, because that's another major part of keeping the science going is getting funding, and funding agencies really like some very specific mechanisms of action that you see, know, or are interested in studying.
Right. Interesting. So like you were saying before, ketone is not just an energy molecule. I think that people are still a little confused. And then I think maybe broadly speaking, people think that oh yeah, it's just another form of energy. You're in ketosis, you're burning that. One of the most fascinating things that I think as well is that, it's sort of a non-specific mechanism of action in all these different pathways. Whereas if you take a drug, it's just usually targeted at one specific mechanism.
Right.
Where this is very broadly positive. I mean, have you found any negative signaling effects, or is it pretty much all just beneficial?
So I would say it's completely dependent on the context that you're looking at. A lot of these effects seem to be beneficial. And of course, that's what we're all most interested in, right? So that's what's being, heavily studied. So an example would be that I would always caution anything that seems like absolutely perfect and, no flaws or no downsides. That I think, I'm extra skeptical of something like that. And I think sometimes there is a tendency to kind of assume, in this field, or where people are very passionate about what we're seeing, because it is very, very encouraging, to assume that, oh, well, it's all good. There could be no, negative type effects. But I'll just talk from experience for cancer, for example. Cancer is a very complicated disease, way more complicated, I think, than is often acknowledged in a conversation, especially regarding something like this. And the ketogenic diet has been studied in a large variety of cancer models, most of which have come back as a positive outcome. Definitely, there are models that it doesn't seem to have an effect either way. If you're looking at the primary outcomes of tumor growth rate and survival, right? But then there are a handful of models and studies that have been published showing that in this specific model, ketosis actually had a negative effect in that the tumors grew more quickly or the animals died more quickly or something like that. And I think of, you were mentioning how ketosis is not like a targeted drug and that it's actually impacting and changing a multitude of things simultaneously. And you have to keep in mind that whatever is going to happen on the, in the broad sense, for example, with, tumor growth or survival, is a balance of all of those changes. It would be so unlikely that every single tiny change that's elicited by ketosis would all be anti-cancer when you think about how complicated cancer is, right? So I tend to think of it as, what is the net effect on the tumor? There may be specific aspects of ketone metabolism or signaling that could be beneficial to some tumors because of their unique genetic or metabolic phenotype. But what's the net effect? Are we still seeing, despite the fact that maybe there's, some benefit there, is there more overwhelming inhibitory effect? And I think that seems to be the case in most models. But for those models, for example, where that, maybe one of those aspects of ketone signaling that is actually pro-cancerous is really important for that model, then you might have a bad outcome. So An example of that would be a melanoma model where the BRAF V600E mutation is present. This is an interesting mutation, stabilizes that kinase signaling and promotes growth and proliferation. Now, some work actually had been done a while ago in skeletal muscle showing that acetoacetate, which is, of course, one of the two primary ketones, will promote the signaling of that pathway through a signaling interaction. And that occurs in our healthy tissue. But if you're a melanoma cell that has this mutation, and that mutation is really important for you, and it is one of the main drivers of your growth and proliferation, and then you add acetoacetate onto it, and it further promotes the activity, then you might have an overall negative effect. And that was what that publication showed, was that in that specific model, because it possessed that specific mutation, ketosis actually promoted the growth of that model, right? So in that sense, even though maybe ketosis was still suppressing glucose, suppressing insulin, it might not have mattered because that model is really, really reliant on that mutation.
Right.
And so we kind of have to, that's why cancer is so complicated. We have to be really careful and give the conversation the nuance that it deserves. It is more complicated, I think, than a lot of diseases. And we have to kind of take the time to evaluate all of these specific situations and to go into clinical trials across the board. So that's just kind of an example of what you kind of made me think of when you asked that question.
Totally. And then another thing you said is that just, it has all of these different effects. And is there any difference between endogenously produced ketones versus exogenous ketones that you would take as far as the signaling potential? Or has that not been figured out
yet?
Hard
question. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question. So there could be, it seems, so one of the things, a lot of what we know about ketone signaling is actually in a context of either cell or animal models where ketones were actually delivered exogenously.
Got it.
Even if it wasn't like an oral, like a ketone product that we tend to think of, just because the way that you design scientific studies, you want to control for every factor. So if you're interested in what beta-hydroxybutyrate does, it's a lot more direct to inject beta-hydroxybutyrate IP in an animal than to put them on this complicated diet and change all these other things, right? So then you're changing multiple variables. So actually a lot of the information we have about signaling in cells, of course in cells don't have, guts or livers or anything, right? So you just directly apply ketones. That's exogenous application of ketones. And then in a lot of these animal models that we've studied, the signaling effects, again, it's ketones being basically just put into the system, either orally or by IV or IP injection. So it's kind of hard, I guess, to answer that question. There are obviously going to be some differences between ketosis induced by a ketogenic diet and ketosis induced by exogenous ketones. You're not changing the macronutrient profile. But when you come down to the actual just signaling effects of ketones, I would say I've not seen very much evidence to suggest that those signaling effects are different. But the duration of ketosis, the degree of elevation, all of that's going to be different. And the context in which it's happening, the metabolic milieu that it's happening in would be different too, potentially. So,
right. I mean, this just sort of goes back to the thing you were saying before, that nutrition is sort of like a signal of what's going on in the outside world. So it's just sort of curious, like you said, if you're not in ketosis and then you just take a bolus of exogenous ketones, obviously I'm a little bit biased because I own a company that produces these, but I mean, regardless, it just seems like all the research that's being done is usually with these kind of compounds, and it seems like we're seeing a lot of the same benefits. So I just want to get your take.
I would say definitely the science seems to suggest that that there are a lot of overlapping effects, because a lot of the effects of ketosis is due to ketones directly. But we don't understand all of it.
Right. Which makes sense sort of, because molecule for molecule, like it's identical. So it shouldn't technically be a different thing, but a lot of people get bent out of shape about, the enantiomer and one maybe is appropriate versus not. I mean, what is your experience there?
It's interesting. A lot of the work that's been done has been done with, it's expensive to produce the pure R isoform of beta hydroxybutyrate. And so, at least the science has typically always been, if you're talking about, exogenously applied ketones, the vast majority of it has been an RS mixture. So if you think about what we know from those studies, most of it was in that context, right? But, if you have an enantiomer that is not going to be metabolized as quickly, I don't know. We don't really understand a lot. I would say there have been studies in humans that have used a mixture for, specific metabolic conditions that require this kind of supplementation for longer periods of time. And at least in those specific case reports, there's not been, negative outcomes reported, but it's not been studied on a widespread stage. So it's definitely an interesting area of research. Most of what we do is done using a racemic mixture of BHB. So there's a lot to be studied there, I think. But
interesting. So as far as day-to-day, what you're working on now, there are several studies at one time that you're working on. Can you share any of the interesting things that you're doing now?
Sure. Yeah. We, let's see. So some of the big work that's being done in our lab right now is being spearheaded by Dr. Andrew Koutnik. He was a former PhD student. He just recently did his dissertation, is now Dr. Koutnik. And he pioneered a study looking at ketosis as a potential way to slow muscle loss in a cancer model. So in cancer, especially late stage or metastatic cancer, it's very common to see cachexia, which is the wasting primarily of muscle mass that we're interested in, but also fat mass. So you've probably, unfortunately known someone or seen someone that is kind of in a late stage of cancer and they tend to kind of waste away. So that's called cancer cachexia. It's a big problem. It contributes significantly to morbidity and mortality in cancer patients. And there's no standard of care therapy for it. We don't really have anything we can do. Andrew has been studying for a while, basically characterizing a mouse model that we use in our lab as a model for cachexia. And then also looking at will exogenous ketones, and in this sense, the ketone ester that we study, which is the RS-1,3-butane-diol diacetoacetate ester. So it provides both beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. Could that potentially reverse some of these effects of cachexia? and he's had some positive outcomes there. And so that's been a really interesting project, and he's working on getting that published right now. So hopefully within the next couple of months, that'll be out, and everyone can kind of read about that work that he's been doing. We are also, just in the last year or so, started up a new line of research in the lab in a disease called Kabuki syndrome, which is an interesting neurogenetic disease caused by mutations in some of these enzymes that control epigenetic modification within the cells. And it can cause developmental delay and some other cognitive and physical deficits in children with the disease. And because of ketone signaling function as histone deacetylase inhibitors, there's some theoretical and some evidence to suggest that exogenous ketones could be beneficial there. So we've recently created or established a Kabuki mouse model in the lab, and we have begun testing some of that. So we have a pilot trial ongoing right now that's being headed up by one of our new PhD students, Sarah Moss, who was previously an undergrad in the lab, and she just started her PhD with us. So those are some of the big projects that are going on right now. And then on top of that, we have a large grant from the Navy, from the Office of Naval Research, to continue looking at the ketone ester that I described earlier as a preventative or mitigation strategy for oxygen toxicity seizures. And so we've been doing a lot of that work in collaboration with Dr. Jane Dean, who's also here at the university and runs the hyperbaric biomedical research course. So those are some of our large projects right now, but we're always interested in starting up new ones.
Sounds like you're pretty busy. If you had unlimited money and unlimited time, what is like the main one or two things that you want to figure out about ketosis?
Yeah. For me personally, I'm really, really interested in untangling the mechanisms that underlie how ketosis affects cancer metabolism. So in a variety of models, kind of understanding the differences between different cancer types and how some cancers may be more or less susceptible to such a therapy, and what's actually going on specifically at a mechanistic level, what's important, what's not important. That would be my main area of focus, and something we are interested in and doing work on, and actively looking for funding for, which is always part of research. But it's
And how would you design that?
So it would be completely, you would have to get very specific very quickly. So you can't, do a bit of a fishing expedition on something like that. There are specific effects of ketones that I would deem most likely key players in something like that. So one thing, for example, I'm very interested in how ketones seem to enhance radiation therapy efficacy for brain tumors. And this has been shown in animal models, being tested in human clinical trials right now, but I'm very interested in understanding why. I think it might have to do with the way that ketones influence our immune system. So designing studies that test basically what's happening at a cellular level when ketones are present with or without radiation, and some of these key, mediating factors that I think might be part of the story. How are they changing in those contexts? How does the outcome change if I activate or inhibit certain steps along the process? That would be kind of how you go about designing some of these studies to test the hypothesis.
Got it. And another big initiative that you're involved in that we love supporting, it's amazing, is the Metabolic Health Summit. So maybe just, if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of motivations behind that whole project. Absolutely.
Thanks. Metabolic Health Summit is a big passion project of mine. Myself, Victoria Field, and Dominic D'Agostino were the co-hosts of this event. It's a scientific conference where our goal is to bring together the world's top scientists, clinicians, thought leaders in this space, not just about ketogenic diet, but that's a lot of it. But we named it Metabolic Health Summit because, nutrition is only one aspect of metabolic health. And that's something that we want to kind of think about into the whole person. How are we going to optimize metabolism to support a healthy lifestyle and hopefully prevention and treatment of disease? And so we are having, it's our fourth event. It'll be in the end of January 2020 in Long Beach, California. And it's a 4-day conference. And we have just really talks on all types, really learning the most recent research in all of these areas of research. So we have a track on cancer, a track on metabolic diseases, on athletic performance, on neurological conditions, mental health, really everything. We also do some fun stuff, like we have nightly receptions. We have a great expo hall, some really awesome brands there that are present. Getting to try out all of their products, like Perfect Keto has been there in the past, been a great supporter of our event, which we really appreciate. And we, have been able to create this environment where people can come together and learn from each other and just really foster this collaborative network from academia to the healthcare field to industry and entrepreneurship. Everyone in this space is really there to learn from each other and network. And we also have a VIP mixer with our speakers so we can get to know them a little more closely. And then also a gala dinner, which we're really excited about, where we support 2 really world-changing nonprofits that are the Charlie Foundation, which is dedicated to providing education on ketogenic therapies related to pediatric epilepsy, and then also Max Love Project, which supports children and their families that have gone through a childhood cancer diagnosis to help them thrive during treatment and then also beyond and after they've gone through treatment. So it's pretty incredible event. And if you're interested, you can learn more at metabolichealthsummit.com. We also have social media pages on Facebook and Instagram. So it's something we're really, really passionate about.
What do you think is the future of that? I mean, like if in 5-10 years, what does the Metabolic Health Summit look like?
So our goal is to be an educational platform, not just at this conference, once a year, but really throughout the year, which is why we put out educational content online on our website, through a newsletter, but also in social media throughout the year. And that's our major focus, is to provide a platform where we can foster collaboration between all of these key participants. We have to really responsibly move this field forward. We want to promote evidence-based conversations about this field and bring together the people that are going to make these big changes. So providing an area or location where the scientists from this country that's doing something completely unrelated can meet this entrepreneur from another country that have, overlapping interests but never would have met otherwise. And together can do something really incredible. So that's our goal, is to be a hub for providing this evidence-based education and platform for people to come together and move this field forward.
It's amazing.
Thank you.
We do a lot here, but I don't know how you're doing as much as you're doing. It's phenomenal.
I don't sleep very much, but no,
it's worth it. I mean, we all appreciate all the work you guys are doing over there. And if anyone's interested in maybe, helping fund some of this stuff or getting in touch with you guys, where would you send them?
That would be great. Just email me. My email is maybe that's not the best one. We could email at info@metabolichealthsummit.com. That would be direct to me, and that would be great.
Awesome. Well, Angela, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate everything you're doing.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. Really appreciate it.
All right. Before we take off, just a quick note that the book Chris Urban and I just published, Keto Answers, is finally available. So 2.5 years of work, and it's finally out. So you can grab it on Amazon, go over there, pick it up. But it's everything you need to know about a ketogenic diet. So it covers 268 questions. You can read it front to back, or you can go to the index, pick out whatever questions make sense for you. Like, can I build muscle on a ketogenic diet? What happens if you have a cheat meal? What happens if you fall off the wagon and need to get back on? All this stuff is covered hopefully it's as helpful as humanly possible. We put it out there because we just kept getting the same questions all the time and wanted everything in one spot. So we did that, and it's out. You can pick it up on Amazon. And again, if you do, thank you so much for your support. Again, a review would mean so much. It would help us reach people who would otherwise maybe not be in a ketogenic diet. So, we're trying to help as many people as possible, and we think this is going to be a really great tool. So if you guys did, thank you so much for your support.